Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where every day I try and add a bit of positivity into your earballs, especially as we're all living in a world of doom and gloom and 24-hour rolling news channels. And we try and do that by sharing human stories of how technology is making a difference to people's lives. But I think we are all, and I include myself in this, guilty of taking things for granted in this life. For example, throughout the pandemic, we've all relied on the internet more than ever before. Many have been doing everything from ordering groceries to keeping up with critical health updates online. However, for millions of people with disabilities, only 2% of all websites on the internet are accessible to them, which makes navigating the internet nearly impossible. But it doesn't have to be that way. And with the scene set, I'm going to ask you to buckle up and hold on tight, because I'm going to beam your ears all the way to Israel, where Raphael Glantz is waiting to speak with us and tell us all about AccessIB and how they're making a difference. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thanks so much, Neil. Yeah, I'm Rafi Glantz. I do partnerships management at AccessIB. More or less, that means that I help partners who are usually agencies, web agencies, website builders, that kind of thing, understand more about web accessibility and understand how to communicate that to their clients, who are usually business owners, so that at the end of the day, businesses can make their websites accessible to people with disabilities.
Love that. But a question I've got to ask is, where did it all begin? I mean, can you share your origin story, where your passion for tech came from, and what was it that put you on this path you find yourself on today?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's two different stories to tell, right? There's the very brief and not so interesting one about me, and then there's the company story and how that happened. So for me, I graduated high school more or less by the skin of my teeth, and went to the military in Israel. And immediately after that, I discovered that, you can work in high tech if you speak good English and you have a strong work ethic. And I found that I learn a lot better in a work environment where I'm getting paid to learn, but also where it's a lot more applicable to real life and feels a lot more real rather than just sitting in a classroom. And so I found myself learning more and more about tech and sort of expanding my own horizons. And just like everything else good, I got rejected from another place, came to an interview with AccessIB, not pessimistic, but not the most optimistic in the world. And here I am a little over 2 years later, very, very, very happy. And as far as AccessIB goes, well, our founders, we have 3 founders. And before they started AccessIB, they had a digital agency in Israel and some other businesses. And right around 2015, I believe it was, Israel actually passed a law for web accessibility, requiring web accessibility, the IS 5568. And some of their web development clients came back to them and said, hey, why isn't my website accessible? You should have built it accessible. And they came back and they said, well, look, you paid us $2,000 for that website. If we built it accessible, it was going to be 12. Do you have another 10 grand? And then they would just be quiet and walk away. So they realized that there is this demand and there is this need, both on the side of people with disabilities who absolutely need and deserve access to the internet, and on the side of business owners who can't afford legal liability, but also can't afford the tens of thousands of dollars that manual remediation will cost on an ongoing basis. So you're sort of stuck between the rock and the hard place, and they realized that AI could potentially be a solution. The Shir Eckerling, who's our CEO, actually built this whole system pretty much all on his own. And it's been working very, very well for the last few years.
And as you said, AccessIB is a leader in web accessibility for people with disabilities. But just to try and bring that to life, can you tell me a little bit more about the kind of problems that you're solving with your tech here?
Absolutely. So I'll give you 2 examples that I think are pretty common, and more or less everybody has met somebody or worked with somebody or knows somebody in their family, by the way, who has a disability. So if you imagine somebody who's blind, so of course they can't use a computer like you or I, because when you use a computer, you're using a mouse, you're using the keyboard, you're looking at things and you're making decisions based on that. Somebody who's blind needs to have all of that information read out to them. And one of the problems with that is that most websites don't have all the information there in a way that assistive technology like a screen reader, which is basically just a device that reads out the material on a website or on a computer for somebody who can't see it. Websites aren't built to work with those usually. So for instance, if you have a bunch of images on your website, Neil or I will be able to see them, but somebody who's blind will just hear in their screen reader image, and then it will go on to the next thing. Now, with some images, I guess that's not so bad. They're just, stock photos from wherever, but some of them have a lot of information in them, or some of them are very descriptive or part of a story. And so somebody will be missing out on a significant portion of the website. Then you go over to the usability side, not just understanding it, and you realize that navigating through a form or a pop-up can be a lot more difficult if you can't see it. Because, for example, if you don't have a second pop-up that comes up when you open one that says pop-up, playing to screen readers, available, if it doesn't explain to somebody who's using a screen reader that it's a pop-up, they might not know it's there and might have to actually shut down their computer to get out of your website. Then you look at somebody who's got motor impairment, maybe they're paraplegic or quadriplegic, maybe they have difficulties using their fingers or hands. Well, maybe they can see everything correctly, but they can't interface with the computer on a keyboard or with a mouse the way that we do. In some cases, they'll use a click stick where they just make clicks and move that way. Sometimes they'll only be able to use the tab key. In other cases, there's an amazing startup that I believe that they're called 6 Degrees. And I do think, I know, I work at AccessIB, but I do think they're amazing and really, really cool. They have this armband that you put on somebody who is who has epilepsy or other disorders that cause them to move a lot. And they're actually able to learn using AI what are normal movements for you, and then interpret your movements as either normal or not normal for when you're trying to control a computer using that. So a lot of different ways for people to interact with the internet, but unfortunately, the internet's generally only built one way, and that's for people who can see and hear and use mouses.
So many great points there. And as someone that writes content for online magazines, etc., I regularly use images and infographics, etc., to bring a story to life. So important that you mention it. And of course, throughout the pandemic, people have relied on the internet more than ever before, doing everything from ordering groceries to keeping up with critical health updates online. However, for millions of people with disabilities, only 2% of all websites are accessible, obviously making navigating the internet nearly impossible. Just how big of a problem is it for people with disabilities?
I mean, it's a real problem.
Yeah.
If you think about it, right? Whatever you need to buy, most of the time today, we're doing it online, especially in the last year and a half. Yeah. With grocery stores in particular, for some people with disabilities, they may also have various medical conditions that put them in a risk group for COVID or other things. And so they may not be able to go to the supermarket in person anymore, but they also can't use the supermarket's website to order food. So how do they get food? That's a real concern that affects somebody's life. Even smaller than that, though, if you go on Google and you search for a shoe store, right? Because you want to buy the new Jordans, whatever it is, you find a shoe store. Well, the first one you find is not going to be accessible, and neither is the second or the third or the fourth or the fifth. In general, it's going to be, you're going to go through 10 or 15 shoe stores until you find one that's really accessible and can cater to you. But the good news is that if you're that accessible store, you're going to have a lot of repeat business, because if you put yourself in the shoes of that person who has a disability and is searching over and over again for, oh God, how can I buy these shoes? Well, once you found that store, you're not going to go back on Google next time and try this whole process again. You should go back to the store that you know, right? But more than that, there's a lot of groups, whether it's WhatsApp or Facebook or anywhere else, where people with disabilities, share about various things about their lives with other people with similar disabilities. So a lot of people who we work with, who do have disabilities, have mentioned that if they find a store like that, again, we'll stick with a shoe store. If they find an accessible shoe store, they're going to put up a post in that Facebook group and say, hey, all of my blind friends or all of my name a disability friends, this shoe store cares about us and caters to us. Let's go give them our business.
Love that. And I suppose that's exactly where AccessIB comes in. So for people listening, especially business leaders and decision makers who we've just set off a huge light bulb moment in their head, can you tell me a little bit more about the technology that you're using to make websites usable for people in the disability community?
Absolutely. I mean, look, if I were going to go through the whole thing, we'd be here for 3 hours, and this is not Joe Rogan, so we can't do that. But one day. But big picture, right? Making a website accessible has so many different parts to it because every website is different and every website has a lot of different moving parts. So rather than you having to hire a developer and then pay them for however many hours, and then every time you update your website, you have to call that developer again and then pay them however many hours to fix what you just did with your new images, we basically taught a robot to do it. I can wax eloquent for an hour about how our different AIs work and all of that. But the best way I know to explain it is that rather than have a human who gets paid a lot of money and doesn't really want to do this work because it is a little bit busy work in a lot of ways for a developer, we taught a robot to do it. And the robot doesn't get paid, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't eat. And until Terminator happens, it doesn't get mad at us for using it like this.
For a business leader that is serious about improving web accessibility for people with disabilities, because there is a huge focus on inclusion at the moment as well, how easy is it to get them up and running with AccessIB?
Super, super easy. It's one line of JavaScript code that gets installed into your website. And actually, we work with pretty much every major CMS. So we have plugins. So if you go on WordPress, Shopify, any of those, it's like 3 or 4 clicks and you are ready to go. It's, I think, $50 a month for their basic plan. It's very, very affordable. And our goal at the end of the day is to make sure that every business owner, even the smallest, will be able to make themselves accessible to everybody. Because in the US, look, 26% of American adults live with a disability. Worldwide, it's about 20%. So cutting out 20% of the market just doesn't really make sense for anybody.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, are there any other digital solutions out there for combating inaccessibility? I've not come across any, but do you have any big competitors out there?
Well, look, I work here, so but here's what I'll tell you. There's a lot of other people out there who do accessibility in a bunch of different ways. Yeah. Right now, because of a lot of steps that we've taken to not only differentiate ourselves, but offer more than just the basic, here's your, accessibility. I think we're very different than anyone else on the market, but there are other companies out there. You have things like EqualWeb, you have companies like First Level Access and User First. So sometimes they'll be doing manual work with developers. Sometimes they'll be consulting with your team. And sometimes they'll offer a product that's similar to ours. One of the things that we did is we actually created a nonprofit in partnership with a bunch of disability-focused organizations that are also nonprofits. It's called AccessFind. And what I mentioned before about Google, when you search on Google, it gives you a lot of results that might not be accessible to you. Well, AccessFind is the world's first search engine only for accessible websites. So if you search for something there, it's going to be accessible and you're going to be able to use it.
Wow, that's incredibly cool. And if we do have a business leader listening, like I said, we've set off that light bulb in their head. They've realised they're missing out of 20% of their market. If you had one takeaway for that decision maker in any large organisation, what would you want them to walk away with?
I would say that the way that you look at accessibility shouldn't just be as a liability. Because it's not just a liability. It's a massive, massive opportunity, both for positive PR to get the word out internally and externally in your company, tell people, hey, we are accessible. We care about making sure that everybody's going to be able to buy our products or get our information. And it's, at the end of the day, a real big business improvement for you. There's no reason to keep people out. Like the example that I always use on calls is, if you had a jewelry store with a strong security door and it was a little narrow and there was somebody outside who was looking in the window but couldn't get inside because of their, let's say, wheelchair, you don't lock the door. You run outside and try to sell this guy a diamond, right? Yeah. So it's the same principle online. You do whatever you can to capture that business.
And looking towards the future, is there anything that makes you hopeful, maybe even excited about the role that technology is going to continue to play in improving web accessibility for people with disabilities?
Oh, a bunch of things. So we are doing a few really interesting things. One is Access Flow, and others Access Campus. Access Flow is basically a tool for developers to work with our automated tool and improve their accessibility both on the source code and on the session. And then Access Campus is, I think, more interesting. We realize that the resources that are out there right now for people to learn about accessibility and how to be an accessibility developer and coder, they're really insufficient. There's just not enough information out there, and it's not presented right. Access Campus is going to be an education center, a full-fledged education center for developers, for freelancers, for agencies, for organizations that want to learn more about accessibility. It will be totally free for freelancers and individual developers and students. For agencies, it will not be free.
Fantastic. And we started today's podcast talking about your origin story, but now I'm going to try and have a bit of fun with you now and find out, what was the soundtrack to your origin story? Is there a song or piece of music that inspires you or just accompanied you on your career in tech? Is there a song and a story you can share with us? And we'll add that song to the Spotify playlist.
Oh, okay. So there's one by a British artist, Earthquake by... Oh, I'm forgetting his name. I apologize. But it's featuring somebody as well. But the song that I've had stuck in my head most recently is by John Mayer. It's what is that song? It's called Last Train Home. He put out this new album, and it's got this very 80s vibe. It's very fun. For a second, I thought I was listening to Africa by Toto, but it wasn't that. It was different.
Yeah, I've heard that album. It's great. It's a combination of, like you said, Toto and a bit of Dire Straits thrown in there as well.
A little bit of Credence as well. It's a really interesting album.
Oh, man, the dude abides. You can't beat a bit of great Credence. So I'll add that to the playlist. But for anyone listening that wants to find out more information about AccessIB and the great work that you're doing there, what's the best way of finding you online and contacting your team?
I think the best thing to do is go to accessib.com. It's just the word access and then IBE.com. We have a fantastic online support chat. They are always real people, and they are very intelligent and happy to help. And on top of that, if you want to contact hello@accessib.com, they'll always be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, the theme on this podcast is always that technology works best when it brings people together. And I also, every day, try and get people thinking about areas they don't associate with technology and the impact that it's having. And the fact that for millions of people out there with disabilities, only 2% of websites are accessible is shocking. It really is. And I must admit, I was fairly unaware of it until today. And that's why I get up and record this podcast every day. And so thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your story and the great work that you're doing at AccessIB.
Thank you. This was really, really nice.
After learning today that only 2% of all websites are accessible to people with disabilities, and yet there is a solution that will change all that for $50 a month, the message to big businesses was loud and clear to me. And people with disabilities should not have to wait any longer for web accessibility. And I cannot thank Raphael enough for showing how technological solutions leave no room for websites to remain inaccessible. And like I said, I don't want to be preaching here because before today's interview, I was completely unaware of this. But that is one of the reasons that I record this podcast, to try and learn something every day from every person I talk with. And if you're affected by anything we've talked about today, or you've got a story that you would like to share, there's also a seat for you on this podcast. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes, and my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. So I generally mean it when I say this. I would love to hear from you all, so keep those messages coming in. You are all the heart and soul of this podcast. I'm just a facilitator. So a big thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.